Hello all, and welcome to the second half of the topic lecture for Thursday, July 9th. In the first topic lecture, we looked at the class systems that divided the Roman people. In this lecture, we will look at how the Roman government functioned. First, we'll start by looking at the voting assemblies in Rome. In order to cast votes, the Romans were divided into 3 separate voting assemblies. Each of these assemblies elected different officials. The patricians, the upper class as we learned in the last lecture, were members of 2 of those assemblies, while the plebeians were members of all 3. The first of these assemblies was known as the Comitia Centuriata. It was charged with electing consuls, presiding over treason trials, and before the Punic Wars, it would vote on legislation. It also elected praetors and censors. The citizens of Rome were divided up into 193 different centuries based on wealth, as determined by the census. Each century had 1 vote. To determine how a century would vote, members voted amongst themselves. Whatever the majority of this vote was would be what the century officially voted for. While this may seem very democratic, in reality it wasn't. First of all, the citizens were not evenly divided amongst the centuries. The wealthy Romans, a small group, controlled the majority of the centuries. Voting also started with the richest century and stopped the minute a majority of 197 votes was reached. This means that the poor were often deprived of the opportunity to vote, as voting would cease before it was their century's time to vote. The second voting assembly was known as the Comitia Tributa. In this assembly, the citizens were divided into tribes by geography. There were 35 of these tribes, 4 urban and 31 rural. They were tasked with electing the aediles and quaestors and voted on most legislation. Just like the Comitia Centuriata, each tribe voted amongst themselves before casting a vote as a tribe. Also, just like the centuries, the voting stopped once a majority of 18 was reached. This system, while it seems a bit more equitable since it's based on geography, also favored the rich. In order to vote, you had to be in Rome. This meant that a farmer living in the countryside had to take a dangerous journey and miss multiple days of work in order to get a chance to cast a vote, while the rich aristocrat who lived in the city was already there. Thus, the vote skewed towards the wealthy. The final voting assembly was the Concilium Plebis, or the Council of the Plebs. While both patricians and plebeians took part in the Comitia Centuriata and the Comitia Tributa, this assembly was only open to the plebeians, in an effort to give them more of a voice in the government. It uses the same 35 tribes as the Comitia Tributa and voted in the same way as all other assemblies. The only magistracy that this assembly elected was the tribune, which was a post that could only be held by plebeians. As we learned in the first lecture for today, both the tribuneship and this voting assembly were only granted to the plebeians in 494 BCE after class conflicts. The next government body we're going to look at is the Senate. According to legend, the Senate was founded by Romulus, who chose 100 of the most noble men to be his advisors. He called them patres, or fathers, and that's where we get the class distinction of patrician from. Only those of patrician class, the supposed descendants of the original patres, could be in the Senate and hold magistracies. Unlike magistrates, senators were not elected, but instead had to meet a wealth requirement of 1 million sesterces. The censor would determine the wealth of each family and then choose senators from those who had been elected to at least quaestor, a magistracy we will learn about shortly. Membership in the Senate was for life. At the height of the Republic, the Senate seated 300 men. Because it constituted the political and financial elite, its advice on matters both domestic and foreign was taken very seriously. As advisory council, the Senate did not make laws. Each enactment it wanted had to be voted on by the people. But thinking back to voting assemblies, which favored the wealthy, this just turned into the wealthy senators proposing things that the wealthy citizens would want and vote for.
Cato, the Senate hears you.
Pompey Magnus, I have a question concerning your friend and co-consul, the darling of Venus, Gaius Julius Caesar. Why does his chair remain empty? Why does he not come home? His illegal war is over. Gaul is long since on its knees. Why does Caesar keep his brave soldiers from their families and friends? For 8 long years, he has gorged himself like a wolf on the blood of Gaul, and thereby made himself monstrously rich. Why? Why Why does he ply the mob with races and fights and gaudy feasts? Why has he paid the debts of every reprobate fool in this Senate House? Why? I'll tell you why he does these things. He wants to buy himself a crown. He wants to destroy the Republic and rule Rome as a bloody tyrant. That's why. Therefore, I move that Caesar's governorship in Gaul be terminated immediately, that his armies be disbanded, and that he be recalled to Rome to answer charges of illegal warfare, theft, bribery, and treason.
In this clip from HBO's Rome, we see a modern interpretation of what a Senate meeting might have looked like. While we don't know for sure if this is what it would have actually been like, the vehemence of some of the speeches that have been passed down, one of which we'll be reading for class, tells us they were often very heated. This is also a good example of the difference between optimates and populares, as we talked about in the class struggle. Finally, on to the magistracies, the different government positions available to patricians. The magistracies of ancient Rome are organized into what was called the cursus honorum. A person had to hold offices in this order if they wanted to reach the top of the government. Each position did different things, but they all had some characteristics in common. You had to be a patrician, and you had to be elected. Each magistracy had a term of 1 year, and to avoid monarchical, one person in charge, you had to wait 2 years before you could be reelected to any office. Each magistracy had a minimum age requirement, and none of them is singular. They are all held by more than one person at a time. This sequence of government positions was firmly established by the end of the 2nd century BCE and continued this way through the empire. The lowest magistracy in the cursus honorum was the quaestor. In order to be elected to this position, a man had to be at least 30 years old. Within the structure of this government, this magistracy was in charge of financial affairs. This includes taxation, provincial finances, and government finances. At the beginning of the Republic, only 2 were elected per year, but as Rome grew in size and needed more help dealing with finances, both at home and abroad, it grew to 20. So by the end of the Republic, 20 men were elected to the position every year. Next up the chain is the aedile. In order to be elected to this magistracy, a man had to be 36 years old. The aedile was in charge of urban affairs and usually financed these things through his own wealth rather than government money. This included maintaining and repairing urban infrastructure like baths, aqueducts, and roads, maintaining the food supply, and staging public festivals. 4 aediles were elected every year. Unlike all the other positions in the cursus, this one was optional, but many men chose to run for it because it was a good way to gain popular support before running for higher office. The aedile is also the first of the magistracies to possess imperium, or the legal right to command the army, and the first of the magistracies to be attended by lictors, bodyguards who carried fasces, which were a bundle of rods with a protruding axe that symbolized the right they had to physically punish others. The penultimate magistracy was the praetor, for which a man had to be 39 years old. This position was in charge of judicial functions in Rome, including overseeing law courts. As Rome and its environs grew in size, the praetors were differentiated. The urban praetor was in charge of the judicial system in Rome, while the foreign praetor oversaw the system for foreigners. As such, while at the beginning of the Republic only 1 was elected per year, by the end of the Republic, 16 were elected annually. Just like the aedile, the praetor had imperium and could be attended by lictors. Finally, men who were elected to this position could also serve as governors in foreign provinces. The head of the Roman government during the Republic was the consul. In order to be elected to this position, a man had to be at least 42 years old. In addition to being the chief executive of the state, these men were also the generals of Rome's armies. Only 2 were elected each year, and that number never changed. They also possessed the consular veto, which meant that one consul could veto the other, taking turns by year. They too held imperium and were attended by lictors. The coin on your screen shows a consul attended by 2 of his lictors. The consul also had the religious duty of ensuring that sacrifices and religious activities were performed properly. This position was so important to the Romans that they dated things by those who held the consulship, even in the empire. In extreme emergencies, there was one other magistrate that could be called upon, the dictator. This man was appointed, not elected, in times that the state was threatened. The Romans of the Republic hated one-man rule, so they put many restrictions on this position. The dictator was only in charge for 6 months before he had to step down, until Caesar, of course, who was appointed dictator for life. The dictator took control of the entire government in hopes that less conflict between the members of governing bodies would lead to more prosperous results for Rome. One last magistracy that is not part of the cursus, but still very important, is the censor. The censor counts the citizens and allocates them into tribes and centuries. As such, he was in charge of appointing new senators and could remove people from the Senate for moral failings. 2 censors were elected every 5 years, and the position lasted for 18 months. It was seen as a great honor to be chosen as a censor. Finally, the only magistracy that was held solely by plebeians. The number of tribunes elected each year varied throughout the Republic. As a position held by plebeians and voted on by the plebeians, their goal was to protect the plebeians. In order to do this without the advantages of the wealth and prestige that the patricians had, the tribunes were granted a number of unusual powers. They could propose legislation like the Senate. They had immunity and were sacrosanct, which meant that they could not be charged with capital crime and punished, or their body harmed in any way. Often this power was used when a tribune saw a plebeian being abused in some way. They could step in, and if they were harmed, the person doing the harm could be punished. They also held a special tribunician veto. They could declare laws invalid, revoke the actions of other magistracies, and overturn legal decisions, all in the name of making things more equitable for the plebs. This system of magistracies continued throughout the empire as well, even though the emperor was the head of the state. Many aspects of the government stayed the same, while many changed. The Senate still existed, but only to ratify what the emperor wanted. Senators could also hold administrative positions within the government. Magistracies were also still elected annually, but a lot of them looked very different. They were all, of course, under the control of the emperor. Instead of running for office, consuls were nominated by the princeps. Augustus transferred most of the aedil's powers to himself, and therefore to all emperors after him. Praetors became more administrators in the government rather than a full magistracy, and much later, the quaestors were made legal advisors to the emperor by Constantine. What is most interesting is that Augustus based most of his powers, and therefore the powers of all subsequent emperors, on those of the tribune. As Rome expanded, many new cities and provinces came under its control. While each city and province was under Rome's control, it also had its own government. The local government was filled with members of the local aristocracy, and usually left to their own devices unless they needed help from Rome. This was very expensive work, and by the 2nd century CE, the aristocracy needed to have a personal wealth of over 100,000 sesterces in order to be able to properly run their local government. Harvey's selection number 14 shows us the lengths these local administrators went to. In this inscription, the local magistrate from Ostia describes everything he did for the city. He held the highest political and religious offices available: aedile, priest, mayor, and censor. And this description also details how much personal wealth he spent on city upkeep and to keep the people happy. He personally financed games, the paving of the forum, the restoration and construction of temples, and even gave money to the town in times of crisis.